what I try to show in the book is how the ties between the US and Israel have moved through 4 stages, through hedging and choosing sides, partnership, and the symbiotic ties. Now, it's often being said that, well, Truman is the first to recognize Israel, but not true. It was Stalin. Truman did it de facto, but never de jure. It took a year to get to that point. Stalin did both immediately, almost overnight. And the reason is that Israel was closer to those egalitarian ideas in the very beginning. It also got its arm from Eastern Europe, Czechoslovakia mainly, thereafter from France. Only later, the US comes into play in the mid to late 60s. So there was a lot of hedging, and one reason was that Americans were very uneasy with the idea of the kind of a 2-state solution that would create constant bloodshed. CIA did a major study around 1947-48 where they said that the creation of Israel or unilateral declaration of Israel might lead to a situation of long-range disaster. And Marshall and many other major influential authorities of American foreign policy were strongly for the idea that there should be a different kind of solution. Truman gave in. He wanted to have the Jewish vote. The cause of the Middle East at the time was such that the constituency on the Arab side was minimal, and also the oil interests were not very strong in the US in that regard, that they could have changed his way of looking at things. And the security state was being created in the US at the time as well. So the relationship moves to choosing sides, then that moves to strategic partnership by Reagan or Nixon and Reagan, 70s and 80s. I think part of the reason was actually the fact that Israel was in deep trouble in 1973 during the Yom Kippur War. And what happened behind the facade was nuclear mobilization. And perhaps one consideration that President Nixon had for the flow of arms quickly to Israel was a fear of what Israelis might do if they perceived this to be an existential challenge. Just like today, there's this consideration of Iran for all the wrong reasons, I believe. So in any case, we're moving to the strategic partnership, and then by 90s and thereafter, particularly with President Bush, into basically symbiotic ties. And these ties have just got deeper and deeper from Bush to Obama and to Trump and Biden. This term ironclad ties that we hear again and again reflects that. In the book, I argue that there are ties that bind, but I don't think these are that kind of ties. These are ties that blind, because it's not good for the US foreign policy, and it's not good for Israeli security. Israel is giving up its sovereignty this way, and there are many Israeli generals who are concerned about this. Who makes the decision of interceptors and what they do and when they do it and how they do it when missiles appear? It may no longer happen in Israel. It may happen in Pentagon. The fourth one is America's massive military aid to Israel. $18 billion in the past year alone. And I can't help but wonder, what if that money had been invested into building new schools, building new hospitals, taking care of people's welfare, social security, Jews, Israeli Arabs, Palestinians, and so on and so forth, rather than for obliteration, thinking that that creates security. And that has led to a lot of things also within Israel, in the sense that when you have so much military aid coming in, then Israel can afford to do certain things on its own. For instance, its military exports intensified as the aid from the US picked up. It's understandable. If the United States is paying for my arms to that degree, then I can afford to start exporting mine. And then you look where those arms are going. Sometimes the ties are with advanced economies like Germany and others, or Germany exports to Israel. But Israel has also got involved with a lot of dirty wars. In the 80s, it was all involved with apartheid South Africa. These are ties that are very, very hard to understand with the history of Israel. And they should never be there, I feel. So this kind of a military assistance has created parallel militarization within Israel. And that's why I had a subtitle for this book about degrading Israeli economy, politics, and military. And I feel this is the end result. So you have these four factors then: ethnic expulsions of Palestinians, settlements, Jewish settlements, US-Israeli military ties, the way they have evolved into symbiosis, and the military aid. And these are feeding each other. We cannot have an end to any or find any durable solution without dealing with these four aspects together and separately, whichever way we choose to deal with them.
Whenever we talk about sovereignty and we talk about security, I think the economy has a great role in all of these aspects. Do you think, how do you find the Israeli economy right now?
You know, I titled the book The Fall of Israel, and immediately people started to speculate. So what does this mean? Does it mean that it's a biblical term, falling from grace? Maybe partly. There were some who felt that I was arguing that Israel is going economically bankrupt. I'm certainly saying that there's an economic fall involved here. And if people aren't careful, a lot more will follow. The downgrades that we've seen lately reflect what's to come if this continues. And still others stress the destructive impact of the perfect storm in the Middle East. But really what I was thinking about was Gunnar Myrdal, the Swedish economist who got the Nobel Prize in the 70s. His book from 1944, American Dilemma, which was really about the gap between the American creed of opportunity and the ugly realities of segregation. And I felt that, my God, in Israel, we have something very similar. These parallels clearly abound in that we have this gap between Israel and Israeli Jews and Israeli Arabs. We have a gap between Israel and the Palestinians, especially when we look at this from GDP per capita living standards point of view. And we certainly have a huge gap between Israeli and the Palestinians. Then we have a gap within the Palestinians between the West Bank and Gaza, a huge gap, part of the reason that we have this terrible situation right now. This is not because of Palestinians, it's not because of Hamas, it's because of the blockade of Gaza after a democratic election 2006. So there are a lot of factors here. And first of all, you have these gaps within Israel. You have gaps between the rich and the poor. And these are just getting worse. Of all the OECD economies in Israel, the gap between the rich and the poor is worst. The welfare state that Israelis were so proud of still in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and for a reason, I feel, there was an effort from the start to create a safe basis for people, Jews, coming to Israel. That's falling apart, and there was never a clear idea actually whose welfare state it really was. If Israel is to be the secular democratic state, as I think most labor people believed from the very start, it didn't happen effectively because the Israeli Arabs lived under military rule for 20 years until the end of the 60s. And even today, and even thereafter, after 1967, 1968, you can make a case of segmentation, differentiation, discrimination, even segregation in certain times and certain periods, and so on and so forth. But when you look at the Israeli economy, I think that there was a great choice that was made in the 1950s. And I talk about it in the last chapter of the book. Then for a moment of time, Moshe Sharet, the first foreign minister of Israel, became the PM, the prime minister. Now, he had paid attention to the Bandung conference of the emerging economies, as we call them today, or the third world at the time, in Indonesia. And he thought that Israel was kind of in between. It came from the West, but it was a colonial state. But it wanted to live in peace with the Arab population. That was his way of looking at it. What it needed was peace, stability, development, regional cooperation. And these initiatives that he was pushing very hard to the point of negotiating a peace settlement with the Egyptian president, Gamal Abdel Nasser, in mid-1950s, these were constantly undermined by those who felt that what was needed was Israeli expansion because the borders that Israel got in 1948 were not big enough. Israel wanted to have more, and it wanted to have Gaza, it wanted to have West Bank, and it wanted to have part of Lebanon after the Litani River. Some people in the Herut movement, which was part of the parties behind Likud, wanted to have more of the greater Israel, but there was just no capabilities that Israel had to go so far. In any case, those options were given up, and as a result, Israel had to struggle a lot economically. Had it not been the German aid, economic aid at the time, I'm not entirely sure that Israel had survived as well as it did. It was the German aid in the 1950s and then American aid starting in the 60s that made a huge difference, along with the support of a Jewry, particularly American Jewry, and which has now taken dark turns as well. So when you look at Israel then today, where does it leave the economy today? It leaves it in a very fragile place. You cannot have this kind of war without it having major implications. They know that this cannot continue from the point of view of the economy. But the Israeli debt per GDP is still relatively low. So you can play this game if you want to. But my God, look at the price. The price being that the Hamas will not end. There will be just a new kind of Hamas, maybe with a different name or the same name, we don't know. The hostages, they have been ignored almost from the very beginning. The Israeli hostages, and not all of them are Jews. The Palestinians, is there any proportion in terms of the Hamas offensive and Israeli defense, which I call net offense actually? Absolutely not. It's almost like a defense gone amok at this point of time. So the results are absolutely devastating for the Israeli economy as well. And I think that they show also that Israel is far more vulnerable than people have thought.